Let me welcome you to the Emile Bustani Middle East Seminar. We're going to conclude with this presentation by Khaled Fahmy, our 37th year. We're a young organization trying to aspire to more years, and we hope to get there. So let me just welcome Khaled, whom I haven't seen in quite a while. Sorry, I'm limping a little bit, but you'll understand. So Khaled is the Edward Keller Professor of North Africa and Middle East at Tufts University, Middle East history, that is. His research interests lie in the social and cultural history of modern Egypt, and his publications include a breakthrough book on the social history of the Egyptian army in the first half of the 19th century, titled All the Pasha's Men, Muhammad Ali, His Army, and the Making of Modern Egypt. That came out in 1997. That was followed by a biography on Muhammad Ali, and it's titled Muhammad Ali, From Ottoman Governor to Ruler of Egypt, which came out in 2008. And more recently, he has an award-winning book on the intersection of law and medicine in 19th century Egypt, In Quest of Justice, Islamic Law and Forensic Medicine in Modern Egypt. And that came out in 2018. And you know, he has countless articles and other kinds of writings. He's currently working on a manuscript that deals with the social and cultural and military aspects of the 1967 Arab-Israeli War, and he's going to, of course, talk a bit about that today. He got his education at the American University in Cairo and at Oxford University, or properly the University of Oxford. You were at St. Anthony's?
St. Peter's.
St. Peter's, sorry. How could I not know? He is a fellow of the British Academy. He was at the Institute for Advanced Study, Princeton, and his most recent book has won 2 major awards, and his pen has hardly run dry. So with that, Khaled, delighted you're here at the Bustani Seminar. Thank you for joining us. Thank you.
Thank you, Philip, for this wonderful introduction. And thank you all for coming this afternoon. And I also want to thank those who are joining us online. For the past 5 years or so, I have been working on the 1967 Arab-Israeli War with an emphasis on the role and performance of the Egyptian army, a performance that was as dismal as it was catastrophic. It is very, very difficult to imagine a worse performance of any army in any battle, modern or ancient. And while there have been many studies that analyze the details of this catastrophic defeat, dealing with such things as strategic assessment, command and control structure, weapon systems, and military intelligence, few have attempted to link events on the battleground in Sinai with political developments back in Cairo, or to explain the performance of the army by reference to the nature of the political system, the Egyptian political system. And specifically to the intense power struggle between the President Gamal Abdel Nasser and the head of his army, General Field Marshal Abdel-Hakim Amir. So this is what I would like to do today, namely to look at military operations in light of the intense power struggle between these 2 men. After a brief summary of the way the war on the Egyptian front is typically told, I will retell the same story, but by taking into account the intense power struggle between them. I will then zoom in on 2 points. The first is the impact on the army's performance of political appointees to senior command posts. And the second is the manner in which Amir got involved in civilian affairs before the war. I will end by making a few remarks comparing how the army got involved in economic matters in the 1960s with how in the present day, Sisi's army has been running its economic enterprises since Abdel-Fattah Sisi assumed the presidency in 2014. Shortly after dawn on the morning of 5th of June, 40 Israeli bombers bombed 18 Egyptian airfields simultaneously. This was followed by 3 other raids that lasted for approximately 3 hours, the result of which is the destruction of 300 Egyptian aircraft on the ground. The Egyptian army, therefore, was left with no air cover. With no air cover, Abdel-Hakim Amir, who was Deputy Supreme Commander of the Armed Forces, deemed the fate of the army in Sinai to be doomed and issued a general command to withdraw all troops to the west of the Suez Canal during the night of the 6th to the 7th of June. With practically no plan for an organized withdrawal, between 80 to 100,000, we don't know exactly how many men, estimates range between 80 to 100,000 men, with their tanks and equipment, raced to the canal, and in the midst of the ensuing clamor, they were easy target of the Israeli Air Force, which had total aerial superiority. By the end of the 7th, the entire Sinai Peninsula was in Israeli hands. 90% of Egyptian Air Force was destroyed. 85% of the equipment and weapons of the land army were either abandoned or destroyed. Around 10,000 men were killed, and another 4,000 were taken prisoner. Back on the 5th of June, and after the Israeli forces had knocked out the Egyptian Air Force, it turned to the Jordanian and Syrian Air Forces and similarly destroyed them in a matter of a few hours. By the end of the 7th of June, the Israeli army was in control of the West Bank and East Jerusalem. On the 9th of June, and after Syria had requested another ceasefire resolution in its confrontation with Israel, the Israeli army launched its attack on the Golan Heights, and by the end of the 10th of June, these strategic heights were also in Israeli hands. I'm sure you know all of this very well. Lastly, at 7 p.m. on the evening of 9th of June, Nasser went to the TV building in Cairo and addressed millions of Egyptians and stunned them by announcing his resignation. But even before he had finished his speech, millions took to the streets of Cairo, asking him to rescind his resignation. The following day, June 10th, he did exactly that, much to the jubilation of the adorning crowds. Needless to say, this war had been extensively studied by historians, political scientists, military strategists, and many others. With regards to the Egyptian front, most Egyptian analysts single out 3 factors as key to explaining the sudden collapse of the army. First, they stressed the devastating surprise attack on the airfields that destroyed the entirety of the Air Force. Second was Amir's character and his style of command, and in particular, his nervous breakdown on the 6th of June and the catastrophic withdrawal order that he issued that day. Third was the dismal performance of senior commanders, most specifically this guy, Othman Nassar, who was in charge of the 3rd Infantry Division, which was the Army's reserve. This is him, I mean, in Arabic, I wrote Nassar, just south of Al-Arish. He was supposed to be in charge of what was imagined to be the 2nd line of defense. As I will explain towards the end of this talk, this general's performance was singularly important, but not in the manner that the official Egyptian narrative wants us to believe. I take issue with these explanations, which I consider to be too simplistic and superficial. A defeat of that magnitude requires a much more complex set of explanations. A defeat so quick, so thorough, and so deep could not be attributed to some bad decisions, a few bad apples, or to the element of surprise alone. What we need is a structural analysis that can explain what was, after all, a systematic, fundamental defeat of the regime. So for a start, let me take the element of surprise and look at this factor a bit more closely. In many Egyptian analyses, and even in the Egyptian collective memory, the early loss of the Air Force, it was the early loss of the Air Force which allowed Israel to command the skies, that was or is taken to be a sufficient cause to explain the outcome of the battle. But was the fate of the army really doomed without air cover? I mean, these are the kinds of questions that I'm asking. Could the army still continue to fight and, of course, lose and be defeated, but not in such a thorough manner? Was there no possibility for the army to withdraw, but not all the way to the west of the canal, but to the mountain passes here, about 30 miles east of the canal? But more to the point, was this Israeli raid really a surprise? We know that on the 2nd of June, 3 days before battle started, Nasser attended a meeting with his general staff in the army headquarters in Cairo. I mean, this is a rare picture that I found hidden in some issue of, I think, al-Musawwar. Nasser is not pictured here, but he attended this meeting soon after the picture was taken. This meeting had been written about extensively by Egyptian commentators because of what I'm going to say, because of what Nasser said to his commanders. Seeing that a war cabinet that included Moshe Dayan had been formed the previous day in Israel, Nasser predicted that the Israelis would attack within 2 or 3 days. He based his assessment on the fact that Iraqi troops were supposed to join the Jordanian front, and he said, if I were Dayan, I would not wait for the Iraqi army to be at my borders. I would attack sooner. In order not to lose international sympathy, he added, Egypt had to receive the first attack and then be prepared to strike back. He then revised his calculation and became more specific and said that most likely Israel would attack on the morning of the 5th of June, that the attack would most likely take the form of simultaneous raids on the airfields, both in Sinai and in the mainland, and that necessary air defense measures have to be taken. So the Egyptian High Command was not only expecting an Israeli raid, it was actually informed by the Supreme Commander of the likely shape and timing of the enemy's first strike. There was no element of surprise there. Now, to understand why the commanders did not heed the advice of their Supreme Commander, we need to step back in time a bit. For this June 2nd meeting itself came at the end of a string of meetings that spanned the previous 3 weeks and that saw a crisis being born, quickly developing and eventually getting out of control. So let us retrace the steps of this crisis, as famously known as the May crisis, critically see how it has been traditionally analyzed, and then to what alternative readings one can subject it. The crisis was born on the 13th of May when the Soviets passed intelligence that subsequently proved to be incorrect. We can talk about why the Soviets did this, that the Israelis were amassing troops close to their northern borders with Syria. Given the fact that over the previous 2 days, both the Israeli Prime Minister, Levi Eshkol, and the Chief of Staff, Yitzhak Rabin, had issued aggressive statements against Syria, and given the fact that Egypt and Syria had signed a joint defense pact the previous year, and in light of accusations from his Arab enemies that he was doing nothing to come to Syria's assistance, Nasser felt compelled to issue a general mobilization order on the 15th of May and to deploy his troops to Sinai. 3 days later, Nasser took the second step that raised the chances of war considerably. On the 16th of May, he issued orders to the head of the United Nations peacekeeping troops on the border with Israel, General Indar Riki, to withdraw his troops from the Egyptian front. These troops, known as the United Nations Emergency Force, had been established in 1957 following the previous crisis, the Suez crisis, that ended with Israel's occupation of Sinai. But then, as a condition of its withdrawal from Sinai, Israel insisted that these troops be deployed only on the Egyptian side of the borders. Ever since then, Egyptian analysts uniformly insist Nasser was looking for an opportunity to remove them. This opportunity finally came with this crisis, and on May 18th, Nasser ordered the withdrawal of the United Nations troops that had acted as a buffer between the Egyptian and Israeli armies. 4 days later, Nasser issued another order that dramatically increased the chances of war. Speaking from the Bir Gifgafa air base in central Sinai, he announced the closure of the Straits of Tiran to Israeli navigation. Again, this is a rare picture. It was difficult to find. Back in 1957, so he announced the closure of the Straits of Tiran to Israeli navigation. Back in 1957, and again as one of its conditions to withdraw from Sinai, Israel had declared that to the United States that it would consider any future closure of the Straits to be a casus belli. Things escalated even further on May 28th, when Nasser gave an international press conference in which he received an awkward question from a British journalist. The journalist said that he had been covering the Middle East since the previous crisis, since '56, and they were now 11 years later, and that he, Nasser, was 11 years older. Are you up to the upcoming confrontation, Mr. President? He asked. In response, Nasser said that unlike Mr. Eden, the British Prime Minister who had resigned in '57, he was not a khira. It's an Arabic word that the interpreters had difficult time translating. A word that I would translate as sisi, with all the loaded sexual connotations intended. Not by me, but by Nasser. The following day, 29th of May, Nasser gave an impromptu speech to parliamentarians who had come to his house to inform him that they had just voted to authorize him to take any measures that he deemed necessary to face the crisis. In that speech, he said that the issue now was not simply to rectify the mistake of 1956 in reference to the United Nations peacekeeping force, but the mistake of 1948 in reference to the very establishment of the State of Israel. He added that the Minister of War, Shams Badran, had just returned from Moscow and relayed to him the Soviet Union's full support, and that it is, quote, standing shoulder to shoulder with us, unquote. These, in brief, are the steps that preceded the famous June 2nd meeting in which Nasser met with his high command and warned them of the impending Israeli attack and predicted that the attack would take place on the 5th of June. These escalatory measures that Nasser took from May 15th to May 29 made it clear for everyone in Egypt and elsewhere that war was inevitable. It is therefore difficult to agree with many Egyptian analysts that see the Israeli attack as a complete surprise, and that this surprise was somehow an important factor that could somehow explain the nature of the defeat. But going through these steps, which I'm again sure that you know it all, raises another question, namely, why did Nasser take these measures that were out of sync with his pragmatic approach and his policy of avoiding a military confrontation with Israel? Over the previous 10 years, Nasser made sure that the front with Israel, his front with Israel, was quiet. Knowing that 70,000 of his troops had been deployed in Yemen since '62, fighting the Yemeni royalists backed by Saudi Arabia, he knew that 2/3 of his army's fighting force was thousands of miles away from home. In dealing with Arab statesmen who were pushing for a military confrontation with Israel, he always urged caution. For example, in the Arab Summit Conference of 1964, which was dedicated to discussing Israel's national water carrier project that both Syria and Jordan feared would result in diverting waters from the River Jordan, Nasser emphasized that they could not afford going to war simply because they were no match to Israeli might. The following year, he explicitly repeated the same message, this time not behind closed doors, in a speech to the Palestinian National Council that was meeting in Cairo, he said, they tell us to expel the United Nations emergency force. And then what? If Syria is attacked, then I have to attack Israel. This means, therefore, that Israel can dictate to me when to attack. We should be the ones who decide the time and place of battle. We will not allow the enemy to dictate them on us. If this was his position in 1965, and indeed throughout the previous 9 years, what prompted him to change course in 1967? If Nasser knew that his army was stuck in Yemen, that the Israeli army was stronger than all Arab armies put together, that his economy was in shambles, and that he was engaged in what had been termed the Arab Cold War, how can we explain these escalatory measures that he took in the second week of May that made war inevitable? There are many Egyptian explanations to this. Critically, Egyptian journalist Wagih Abu Zikri, who is a journalist, he's not a historian, but he used to cover the war in Yemen. And then in 1973, he published this damning account of the 67 war. So this is about the Yemen war, this is about the 67 war. He met the generals in both wars. He knew them personally. This is a fascinating book. It's written in the form of an exchange of letters between an Egyptian officer in Yemen and his wife in Cairo. So basically explaining the war in Yemen and how it was perceived by people in Egypt, in Cairo. In these two books, Nasser, in reference, in this one, in reference to 1967 war, says that Nasser was a victim of his populist politics. Seeing that the Palestinian Fidaiyin was stealing the lights from him throughout 65 and 66, with their armed incursions inside Israel from Jordan and Syria, he decided to, quote, heat up the Egyptian front a bit. This is how he explains this rhetoric of Nasser in May of 67. On his part, Hassanin Heikel, needless to say who he is, well, his friend and advisor, editor-in-chief of Al-Ahram, and a key player. Heikel is not just a journalist. Heikel is a strategist. He not only informed Nasser of international public opinion, I think he drew policy. We can talk about this, and especially about an article, a very serious article that he published in Al-Ahram on the 25th of May, in which he said that Egypt should receive the first attack. But this is a 1,000-page long book. One of the most interesting aspects in the book, in addition to analyzing Amir's character psychologically, is his account of how Nasser managed this crisis. And he says that Nasser fatally ran the 1967 crisis with a 1956 mentality. There are countless other explanations that have been proposed over the half century that have elapsed since the war ended, but few have attempted to link closely the military with the political. There are 3 scholars, however, that have gone further than most along these lines, that is, connecting events in the Sinai Desert to struggles within the corridors of power in Cairo. These 3 scholars are George Gorich, who published an important article in 1987 analyzing the Egyptian High Command. It says 73, but there's a comparison of 67 in that article. Risa Brooks, whose 2008 book, Shaping Strategy, had a chapter dealing specifically with Egypt, with 67. There's another chapter dealing with 73. And most importantly, Hazem Kandil's book in 2012, Soldiers, Statesmen, and Spies, analyzing the power struggle between what he considers the 3 pillars of the Egyptian state, the army, soldiers, the presidency, statesmen, and the intelligence services, spies. In the few remaining minutes, I would like to build on the work of these three scholars to offer an alternative reading of the war itself and the crisis that led to it. The key to understanding both the crisis and the war is to realize that there was a deep rivalry between Nasser and Amir. This rivalry, or schism, shaped how Nasser managed or mismanaged the crisis of May 1967. The rivalry had its roots much earlier and can be traced all the way back to 1956. And it didn't stop with the June War, but continued after the guns had fallen silent and led to a tragic ending that befits the crassest of Hollywood movies. The relationship between these two men is an intimate one. This is a very intimate gesture. They had been colleagues together in the military academy and served together in various postings after graduation. They both fought in the 1948 war, and they both planned and carried out together the coup, the 1952, that deposed the king. And it is that particular experience, the night of the 23rd of July, 1952, that caused the bonding to be very, very close. Following this successful bloodless coup, and to forestall the possibility of a further coup, Nasser and his colleagues chose Amir to head the army. He was thus promoted 4 ranks at once, and then he immediately purged the high brass, replacing them with younger, more loyal officers. أهل الثقة لا أهل الخبرة. The men of loyalty, not the men of experience, became an official motto that reflected Amir's policy to coup-proof the army. Gradually, Amir appointed his own friends and cronies in senior positions, the most important and lucrative of which were in his own office that soon became a center of power within the whole country and also a den of corruption beyond imagination. Spent the past month reading about this corruption, which again makes a very bad third-rate movie, but it was very significant. It's the assistants to the commander-in-chief of the army. It's the people who ran his office. Following the Suez Crisis, which Nasser won diplomatically, but Amir lost militarily, Nasser pressed Amir to remove or demote the senior commanders responsible for the lackluster performance of the army, especially General Sidqi Mahmoud, the commander of the Air Force, who lost all 200 plus aircraft that had been recently acquired by being shot on the ground. It's 56. But Amir would hear nothing of it, saying that these were his sons. He added that the army was not responsible for the military defeat, as Nasser had not consulted him about the army's readiness when he nationalized the Suez Canal, the measure that triggered the whole crisis. As a result, Sidqi Mahmoud remained in his post all the way till 1967, thus becoming the only Air Force commander in history who lost his Air Force on the ground not once, but twice. It was clear that Amir was building a power base for himself in the army. And while one after another of the coup plotters, the 3 officers were losing their positions, leaving Nasser alone in power, Amir managed to cling to his positions in the army, thanks primarily to the loyalty of his high brass. To placate his ambitious rival and friend, Nasser promoted Amir to the rank of Field Marshal in 1958. This was the first decision that Nasser took after he'd become elected the first president of the United Arab Republic, after the union with Syria. When the union with Syria was declared in 1958, Nasser appointed Amir governor of the northern province, thinking that this is one sure way of getting rid of him. Also, he thought. When the union was dissolved 3 years later, following a coup that was hatched in Amir's Damascus office, Nasser thought that Amir had lost all credibility, even within the military, and that the moment had finally come to replace him with a more professional commander. But Amir clung to his position once again, thanks to the loyalty of his own officers. What complicated matters further was not simply that Amir had the army while Nasser had the streets, but that they were actually best friends. As I have just mentioned, their relationship goes back all the way back to the 1930s when they were cadets together in the military academy. After their respective marriages, the two families became friends. Nasser's wife was friends with Amir's wife. The kids used to play with each other. The two families spent the summers together in Alexandria. One of Nasser's sons was named after Amir, and one of Amir's sons was named after Nasser. Nasser's brother was married to Amir's daughters, one of Amir's daughters. This is Hussein, Nasser's brother, and this is Amir's wife. And this is Nasser's wife. Still, this close personal relationship did not prevent Amir from building an independent power base for himself in the army, and for Nasser to feel threatened by this power base. Things reached a dramatic confrontation in 1962 when Nasser suggested the formation of a 5-member presidential council and invited Amir to join on condition of leaving the army. After a standoff that lasted an entire week, during which time Amir argued that he could not guarantee the reaction of his commanders if he quitted, Nasser relented. This is what is referred to in the literature as the white coup. Emerging victorious from these repeated confrontations with Nasser, Amir moved steadily to enhance his power within the army and then to use it as a springboard from which to encroach on various aspects of civilian life. First, he forced Nasser to pass a presidential decree, Decree 2878 of 1962, authorizing him, that is Amir, to be in charge of, quote, active and reserve commanders of the armed forces, thus effectively barring Nasser from appointing, promoting, or dismissing the high brass. Nasser lost control of the army since 1962. 2 years later, another presidential decree was passed, 117 of 64, moving all responsibilities pertaining to the armed forces from the supreme commander, that is Nasser, to the deputy supreme commander of the armed forces, that is Amir. That same decree detached the budget of the air forces from the budget of the Ministry of War, which allowed Amir to be in complete control of all financial matters pertaining to the armed forces and to prevent Nasser, the cabinet, the press, or any auditing agency from having any oversight on the growing military economic complex. In 1966, Amir succeeded in expanding his control over economic matters in 2 significant ways. First, he appointed his own secretary, Shams Badran, as Minister of War. Now, it was the Minister of War who reported to him. It's the executive reporting to the head of the army, not the other way around. Second, he was appointed as the head of the Committee of the Liquidation of Feudalism. This committee was formed when a member of the Arab Socialist Union was murdered by members of the large land-owning family in the village of Kamshish in the Delta. Nasser, the Arab Socialist Union, and the cabinet felt the need to curb the power of landowners. But lacking the coercive power needed to confront these powerful men, Nasser delegated this responsibility to Amir. On his part, Amir jumped on the opportunity and unleashed his military police, whose powers have been augmented to arraign and try civilians on thousands of landowners. Many soon found themselves put under sequestration, with military officers acting as overseers of the sequestered property. More significantly, this presidential decree was soon followed by a decree of Amir's specifying the responsibilities of the Minister of War. This decree stated that the Minister of War would supervise not only the works of military intelligence, personnel and promotions, morale and public affairs, but would also control the departments of Coast Guards, Fisheries and Customs, the economic organization of the armed forces, and the industrial attachés in Germany and the Soviet Union, which were responsible for arms purchases. By the beginning of 1967, therefore, the Egyptian army was in a very strong position domestically. It had captured considerable terrain from its main adversaries, the Arab Socialist Union, the executive branch, the civilian intelligence agencies, and the presidency. Amir seemed to have managed to match Nasser in power and prestige, Whereas Nasser had much international clout and uncontested support from the streets, Amir had succeeded in creating within the army a state within a state. Moreover, he managed to lay the foundations of an economic empire under the control of army officers. This military economic complex was composed not only of the industries geared for military production, but also a myriad of public sector companies and organizations that were gradually brought under the control of the army and snatched away from any civilian oversight, including that of Nasser and the ASU. This coveted economic power was protected by the coercive arm of the military police and its expanded jurisdiction that allowed it to arraign and try civilians. All of this was grafted upon a culture of corruption and impunity that was fed by 5 years of war in Yemen and the lack of any civilian scrutiny over the conduct of that war. Above all, this military economic complex was made possible by the internecine power struggle within the state, which resulted in Amir squeezing Nasser and his clique out of many lucrative businesses, and with him and his cronies turning Egypt into their own milk cow. It is this rivalry between these two men that we need to take into consideration when analyzing the events of the May crisis and of the war itself. A close scrutiny of the events leading to the war that appeared to be of Nasser's doing reveals that it was Amir who was calling the shots and that it was Nasser who was trying to rein in his impetuous rash of the army. But Nasser found himself caught between a rock and a hard place. On the one hand, his best friend in charge of the army was telling him that the army was ready for a confrontation with Israel, with all the innuendos that, like, I'm a man, you're not man enough, we're ready, you're not ready enough. On the other hand, public opinion, both in Egypt and in the Arab world, was egging him on. Let us consider more closely the events of the May crisis. Let us revisit them. First, when Nasser received the Soviet news about Israeli troop deployment on the borders, he was not comfortable with it. He sensed something is up. So he dispatched the chief of the general staff, Fawzi, who was his man in the general staff. Amir and Fawzi were arch enemies. And Nasser insisted on appointing Amir as the chief of staff to be his man in the general staff. He sent him to Syria to see for himself. Fawzi says in his memoirs that he flew to Syria on the 14th, landed in Damascus midday, took a helicopter to check the borders himself, found no signs of Israeli deployment, wrote a report to that effect, flew back to Cairo to report to Nasser, only to discover that Amir and his generals had met in Nasser's absence, and of course in his own absence, and declared a general mobilization, followed by orders for the mobilized troops to be deployed to Sinai within 48 hours. In other words, the first decision that triggered the May crisis was taken by Amir, not by Nasser. Second, and with regards to the withdrawal of the United Nations troops, we now know that Nasser's intention was to ask for only a partial deployment, a redeployment, not a withdrawal. When he asked Amir to show him copies of the letter to be sent to General Riki, Amir sent him Arabic and English versions. Nasser amended the Arabic version so that instead of demanding a withdrawal of all UN troops, it spoke only of partial redeployment. But on May 16th, he called the president, Amir called the president to apologize. Due to a supposed mix-up, the English version of the letter he submitted to the United Nations still demanded a full withdrawal. Nasser quickly contacted the United Nations in New York headquarters in New York to retract the order, but the United Nations Under Secretary General Ralph Bunche refused. In other words, the second decision that escalated the May crisis was also taken by Amir, not Nasser. Third, and the most momentous decision, that of closing the Straits of Tiran to Israeli navigation, was also taken by Amir, not Nasser. It is announced by Nasser, as we saw in the Bir Gifgafa Efi, but it is true, but we now know from this book, which was published in 1990, this book is very significant. It's written by this guy, Mamdouh Anis Fathi, who was spokesman to Abu Ghazala in the 1980s. He's an ex-army officer, a senior officer. And as such, he was allowed access to the archives, the military archives. Now, very few men, very few people, very few army officers are allowed there. But because of his very senior positions, he eventually became the professor in Ain Shams University, I think. He was allowed access. What this book contains is, for the first time, we see official Egyptian documents, including documents about a meeting that took place at Nasser's home on the day prior to his announcement of the closure of the streets of Tehran, 21st of May. In that meeting, which was attended by Amir, Nasser, Sadat, Zakaria Muhyiddin, and a couple of other associates of Nasser, not the cabinet. The question of what to do with the straits was raised now that the United Nations troops had evacuated their positions. Nasser said that we should stop short of closure and be content with announcing control over the straits. The issue was put to a vote and Nasser won. Amir quickly retorted by saying that he could not control the temper of his men if they see Israeli ships sailing under their noses. At best, he was accusing Nasser of not being man enough. At worst, he was threatening a coup. Following Amir's fiery speech, the question was put to another vote, and this time Amir won. That is what prompted Nasser to give the speech the following day. Fourth, we can now understand Nasser's deliberate choice of words during the May 28th press conference, when he answered the British journalist by telling him he was not a Sisi like Eden. This message, in my reading, was intended to his army as much as to the British public opinion. He was telling Amir and his cronies that he was up to the job. Fifth, and more significantly, Amir was planning offensive military operations against Israel without Nasser's approval. And the details of these plans are fascinating. As is well known, on the 26th of May, the Israeli Foreign Minister, Abba Eban, had a meeting with President Johnson in the White House. He had arrived to call upon the United States to live up to its pledge to Israel that it had given in 1957 to come to its assistance in case the Straits of Tehran are closed. During this meeting, that was also attended by the Israeli ambassador to Washington, Avram Harman, the ambassador received a phone call from his embassy. He excused himself and then came back saying that he had received an urgent message that says that Israel had received knowledge, not information, he insisted, that Egypt was planning an attack the following day. Immediately following that meeting, Johnson called the Soviet Premier, Kosygin, who in turn immediately called his ambassador in Cairo, Dmitry Puyadev, who went to Nasser's home at 3 a.m. and delivered Moscow's message to him. Nasser denied any plans, any knowledge of any plans of any Israeli attack on Israel. After the Soviet ambassador left, Nasser called Amir and asked him if he had been planning such an attack. And when he replied in the affirmative, Nasser scolded him and ordered him to abort the attack. So in all the steps of the May crisis, it was Amir who was adding fuel to an already explosive situation, while Nasser was trying to rein him in. But at the same time, as I was saying earlier, Nasser was hostage to his own populist rhetoric. This at a time when the state apparatus that he had created proved totally ineffective in containing these two adverse factors. His unruly commander-in-chief on the one hand, and his own incendiary rhetoric on the other. Two last points before I make a final concluding remark connecting all of this to the present. The first is to explain Amir's rationale behind these measures. Amir truly loved Nasser, and I don't think he ever seriously contemplated a coup against him. I think he was content to be number two. Still, he was stubborn and proud, and thought that if there was anyone who could understand Nasser and figure him out, it was he. Seeing that all his former comrades of the coup of 1952 had been sidelined by Nasser, with some put under house arrest and others had their property confiscated, He saw that the only way he could avoid a similar fate was to use the army as his power base, to tie his fate to that of his officers, and to make Nasser think twice before removing him from the army. As far as Israel is concerned, I think this came second to his own struggle with Nasser. He certainly thought Israel to be an enemy, but he never really understood the grave danger that it posed to his army. His intelligence services were busy spying on his own officers to see who were loyal to him and who to Nasser. Spying on Israel was definitely important, but not as important as maintaining the loyalty of his own men. To say that he underestimated Israel's strength is a gross understatement. As he himself said in a famous meeting with his generals on May 27th, when revising the deployment plan in Sinai, he had a vendetta with Dayan since 1956, and he looked forward to the opportunity to settle the score. At best, he hoped to drag Israel into a small border skirmish, the outcome of which would be to restore his pride that he lost both to Dayan and to Nasser in 1956. At worst, the outcome of the skirmish would be less than successful, and in that case, Nasser would bear responsibility. He never thought that the outcome would be that catastrophic. The second point is to explain how the rivalry between these two men affected the actual combat of the troops in Sinai. Now, this is what I've been studying for the past 5 years, but I want to concentrate on a couple of things. I mean, of course, this can be a subject of a separate lecture in its own right, but suffice here to say that therein lie the key to understanding the performance of the army. Again, this rivalry between them. Plans were constantly being changed as a result of this rivalry. Fawzi, the commander, the chief of general staff, said that the plans of the deployment of 100,000 men was changed 4 times in 20 days. There were regiments that moved before battle 800 miles before a single shot was fired because of the constant redeployments. Even the chain of command was changed. And this is what, when Nasser appointed Fawzi here, Amir made sure that he finds a way to circumvent him. The result is that the different units, which to start with had never actually been trained to fight with each other, the different branches of the Air Force, of the armed forces, and especially the land forces in Sinai, when receiving an order, they didn't actually know who the order was coming from. Most seriously in my mind was the impact of the political appointees with which Amir aimed both to reward his cronies and to tighten his grip over the army. Only 6 months before the war, Amir changed the commanders of all major divisions. There were 6 divisions in, eventually 6 divisions in Sinai, with Nasser having no say whatsoever in this. Among the new division commanders was the guy we saw earlier, Othman Nassar. Nassar was given the 3rd Infantry Division and was entrusted with holding the 2nd line of defense south of Arish. When Arish fell in the early hours of June 6th, he was ordered to launch a counterattack to recapture it. Instead, he procrastinated for 13 hours, despite having more tanks, more equipment, and more men than his enemy. Then, in the evening of June 6th, after these long procrastination, he finally made up his mind. He decided it was time for him to pack and leave. He deserted his troops, all 11,000 of them, and headed to Cairo. Following the war, he was put on trial and sentenced to 25 years in prison. Nassar's ending, this guy's ending, offers a good conclusion to the twin stories I tried to tell this afternoon. The rivalry between Nasser and Amir and the military defeat in 1967. So the heavy sentence that Nassar received was not because of his desertion or dereliction of duty, but because he participated together with many other defeated generals in staging a coup after the war against Nasser. This is not a court martial. This is a civilian tribunal. This is a special civilian. This is a revolutionary tribunal. He was tried elsewhere in a court martial, but the sentence that he received, the 25-year sentence that he received, was not because he deserted his men, but because of the coup that he staged. Throughout June, July, and August, the defeated generals, together with many of Amir's cronies, gathered together in Amir's home, overlooking the Nile, and plotted to arrest Nasser, his security chiefs, and the new generals who had replaced them following the defeat. This is what I've been working on. The country was split in two. On the left are Amir's men, on the right are Nasser's men. These are not insignificant figures. This is Nassar here. This is the head of military intelligence. This is the head of the commandos. And this is the minister of interior. This is the minister of war, and many other defeated generals who turned Amir's home to a bastion and a fort very, very at the heart of Cairo. And they started to plot how to get rid of Nasser. They put a plan and they decided to attack on the 27th of August. And it was this guy, the Nasser's chief of staff, together with Zakaria Muhyiddin, the guy who put in place Egyptian intelligence services in the 1950s. He's called, Nasser called him Beria. Nasser had a nickname for everyone. His nickname for, so it was, they hatched the plan literally in the 11th hour. And the way things came to a close was really the most dramatic ending one can imagine. These men advised Nasser, gave Nasser the same advice that these men gave to Amir. These men told Amir, invite him to his home, to your home, and arrest him. These men advised Nasser to do the same thing. They were quicker. Nasser invited Amir. Amir thought that this was an invitation to patch things up and to tell him to accompany him on the trip to Khartoum for the famous summit in early September. So he went on the 25th of August in what is known as the Last Supper of the Field Marshal, Al-Asha al-Akhir lil-Mushir. He got in the Nasser's home, he got disarmed, his men disarmed him, and he was detained while Nasser moved Fawzi to Amir's home, where these men had been gathering for the previous 3 months, put them under arrest, took him, then took Amir to a remote rest house, as it's called, of the army, close to the pyramids, where only a few months before Amir used to have his own rowdy revelries. There, he committed suicide on September 13th, or as the joke in Egypt went, he was suicided on September 13th. Now, I started working on the history of this most catastrophic defeat 6 years ago on the 50th anniversary of the war. Back then, I organized a small conference in Harvard to which I invited a handful of scholars and in which I had my first attempt to understand how this momentous event took place. Over these 6 years, I deepened my knowledge of the 1960s Egypt, while at the same time keeping an eye on what was happening in present-day Egypt. And the deeper I investigated Nasser's Egypt, the clearer the parallels with Sisi's Egypt appeared to me. Sisi's media have often compared him to Nasser. He once famously said that he envied Nasser for his media, in reference to the total control that Nasser had over the media, a media, incidentally, that was broadcasting fictitious victories over the Israeli army throughout the first 3 days of the 1967 war, and even claiming that the Egyptian army was at the gates of Tel Aviv. While it is useful to conduct a comparison between the degree to which Nasser controlled his media and how Sisi has managed to completely manipulate Egyptian media, the more fruitful comparison, I believe, is between Sisi's army and what I think you will agree with me, or I hope you will agree with me to say, Amir's army. For the Egyptian army nowadays has become so deeply involved in running the economy that this comparison is begged. Like Amir before him, Sisi has successfully established a huge economic empire run by the military. According to Yazid Sayer's exhaustive study of Sisi's army, quote, the military now delivers massive infrastructure projects, produces consumer goods ranging from food to household appliances, manufactures industrial chemicals and transport equipment, and imports basic commodities for civilian markets. It has expanded into new sectors as diverse as gold prospecting, steel production, and managing religious endowments and pilgrimage. In parallel, thousands of retired senior officers benefit from the military's powerful political influence to occupy senior positions throughout the state's civilian apparatus and public sector companies, complementing the former military economy while benefiting themselves, unquote. Sorry for the long quote. And just as Amir justified his army's management of civilian sectors, arguing that it is only the military that has the technical and managerial expertise needed to run something like the Cairo transport system. We all know what this led to. Sisi repeatedly uses the same argument. It's only the army that can deliver, and there's a complete disdain for civilians. Similarly, just as Amir refused to have any civilian oversight over the military's budget, Sisi's general adamantly refused to hand over any civilian agency, even those run by ex-army officers like the Administrative Monitoring Authority, any right of auditing or supervision. There are, of course, many differences between Amir's army and Sisi's army. For one thing, with the scepter of the army's involvement fresh in mind, Sisi has refused to get his army involved in foreign adventures. Above all, unlike Nasser, Sisi has no Amir to contend with, for he has managed to remove from the scene any contender to power within the army and outside it. The question remains, however, of the degree to which the high brass are more wedded to the lucrative business they now run than they are to their commander-in-chief. Above all, it is the complete lack of civilian oversight or supervision over Sisi's army that is most alarming. In my study of the catastrophic defeat of 67, I am under no illusions of how stronger Israel was, economically, diplomatically, and militarily. I also realize how harmful the presence of so many troops in Yemen was, 2/3 of the fighting capacity of the army. And as I tried to argue in this talk, I see only too clearly how damaging the split command of the army was. However, I believe that beneath these serious problems lay the structural problem of the lack of any civilian oversight over the army. War is too important to be left to the generals, Clemenceau is famously reported to have said. How more true this is when the generals are busy running the economy. Thank you very much.
That's really a very systematic, complex analysis, and I know we all appreciate it. And but to make it clear, it isn't simply troops stationed in Yemen. I mean, it's far more than that from what your research has shown us. So I'm just looking here, nothing yet. So we can open this up to any of you who may wish to pose a question or a comment. Please.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Wait.
Very interesting.
Oh, hold on, yeah, sorry, we need to use the microphone.
Okay. So Khaled, Going back to Yemen again, because growing up in Egypt at the time, that's all what remains in my memory, Yemen and the Yemen war. Is it possible to believe that Nasser did not realize that Amir was losing Yemen and he would entrust him to fight Israel? I mean, all of us as commoners knew that we were losing Yemen, that Amir was using Yemen. Is it possible to think that, you know, the man in charge couldn't see that?
Anwar al-Qadi, the chief of operations, Rais al-Amaliyat in 67, who was a very high commander in Yemen, like maybe number 3, says in an interview that he gave in the 80s that he actually went to Nasser in 1966 and told him we're losing and begged him to get out. He says that Nasser responded by saying, I can't lose face to Faisal. Now, the problem with these anecdotes and stories is that, of course, we don't have official records. What we have are, you know, these hearsays. Of course, that is common, but the thing is, when I read these accounts like this, I always have in mind this. This is a split on. Anwar al-Qadi is actually Amir's man. Now, of course, they're all defeated. I mean, there's no easy way out. So he's saying this in 1988. In the 1980s, in this interview, basically to say, which is a common mantra of the Amir men, that the political leadership of Qiyada Siyasiyya, basically Nasser, is responsible for everything. So his point is that even when we, the military, wanted to get out of Yemen, the political leadership would not allow it. I mean, I am a historian of the 19th century, not of this period. And I'm a historian who works with documents. I'm completely helpless. I have no documents. So typically, when I'm confronted with a claim like this, I'd like to check it against some kind of record. Not that the record would resolve any disputes, but I don't have anything to corroborate this. So we have, we of course have the victor's version. It's very difficult to know what Amir's men thought. So this is one very rare occasion of someone in, he said also that we were paying up to £2 million per day. Which is a, you know, again, when I read this figure, it's a nice round figure. I think, and you probably know better, it was in the air because Wagih Abu Zikri in his book on Zuhur Tudfan fil Yemen mentions it in this exchange between husband and wife. The wife in Cairo tells him, we know that we lose 2 million. She mentions the same figure. So to what degree is this, when Anwar al-Qadi says this in 1988, is he actually remembering correctly? To what degree is he repeating things that were circulating, you know, urban myth kind of thing? I don't know.
Okay, yes, and I'm going to ask a couple of questions. Thanks, sir. Yeah, thank you.
Your previous comments notwithstanding, I still find it extraordinary that, given your analysis of what happened in May 67, the degree to which Nasser appears both helpless and outmaneuvered by, repeatedly, on the number of occasions that you mentioned yourself, by Amir and his group. The sense of, isn't he really culpable in the sense that he could have acted differently, but didn't? And didn't perhaps because of this image that you've shown, very poignant image. But the danger, I think, perhaps in what you're saying is that it looks like Nasser was a victim in this, and that it was Amir's all maneuverings and his ability to use his power base in the army without Nasser being able to do anything. It seems to me that Nasser could have done something and didn't. The second point, which is a broader one, given everything that happened in '67, isn't the recovery of Egypt, the Egyptian army, so soon after '67, both in the war of attrition and later on in 1970, isn't it the more remarkable that a truly professional army, at least for that period, was built and managed to perform adequately, let's say in 1973?
Thank you. Wonderful questions. With regards to your first point, I know that when I present something like this, and I have been misunderstood by many people in Egypt to be attempting to exonerate Nasser somehow. I know that this is not what you're saying, but this, of course, is not what I'm meaning. What I mean is that the explanation has to go, which is what Hazem Qandil says basically in his book. This is not really about these two men. It's the political system, it's the two institutions, the presidency fighting the army. So this is one explanation. But I think to go back, for example, to the crisis of 1962, when you read the memoirs of Baghdadi, Abdel-Latif Baghdadi, and Anwar al-Sadat, and others referring to it, they couldn't believe it. They met with Nasser for 7 hours to tell him, this is your golden opportunity. He came back from Syria wounded, get rid of him. Nasser tries to find Amir, and it's as if Amir in modern parlance had switched off his phone. He disappeared. Turns out that he was in Marsa Matruh. Didn't tell anyone. Eventually, Nasser finds out where he was, summons him, and sits with him for 11 hours. And after these 11 hours, of course, we don't have a record of these 11 hours, but what we have after these 11 hours is Amir's promotion, not his dismissal. So Sadat in his memoirs says, we couldn't believe this. So what I'm saying was actually, it's now known. I'm not privy to some documents. It's just public knowledge. So this crisis was, and I'll give you another example. When the defeat happened, after the defeat, in June, our ambassador to Moscow, famous Murad Ghalib, comes back to Cairo, goes to meet Nasser immediately, enters his office and finds him, completely ashen and devastated. And he wants to console him. He tells him, we're not the first to be defeated. And then he tells him, but at least Murad Ghalib tells Nasser, but at least you managed to get rid of the Janissaries. To which Nasser responds by saying, did you know? This was like, the closed secret. He said, yes, of course. I was in Moscow receiving orders from you and from him. Not, and him doesn't go through the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. I was receiving conflicting orders. No, we all knew, but at least you got rid of. So I think Nasser, this is my argument. This is a systemic defeat. This is not just a failure of character on the part of Nasser. Nasser put in place that political system that made him incapable of dealing with this crisis. The last thing I would say, this speech I said that Nasser gave on the 29th of May when the parliamentarians came, moment of crisis, parliament, they left the building, had parliamentarians, MPs, march through the streets of Cairo to go and give Nasser on a plate the country. Tell him, you are authorized to do anything and we will just sit and clap. We mentioned this, it's on passing, but I think herein this I mean, this is not only their responsibility, it's also Nasser's responsibility. Latifa Zayat, in her memoirs about 1967, has a very poignant remark about Nasser's funeral, when people felt orphaned. And she said, I will never forgive a president, a leader who makes his people feel orphaned. I mean, that's not a sign of course, it's a popularity, definitely. Coming back to your second question, this is a very complex character. And I think Nasser's best moment, really, is the 11th of June, when he decides that he's not going to sign and that he will live to fight. You know, devastated army, country, his world has collapsed. And he knows, I think he knew he was dying, and he decided to fight. And there is he goes to the army. And on the 11th of June, these men go and storm his house, want to arrest him. So he cashiers them on the spot and appoints a new leadership, and the story goes. But a couple of months later, he goes to the front. He never went to his men, to the army. He goes to the front. And now we have in the Library of Alexandria some messages that, that he delivered to the men on the front. I tell you, only last month when I was reading this, I teared reading his message to his men. And this is not for the public consumption. This was not announced. This is now discovered way later when his daughter found these letters and delivered them to the Library of Alexandria. They were never published. And he talks to them as a mortal. I think this is why I'm saying he knew he's dying. He said, we're all going to die. I don't know when I will live to see the land liberated. I cannot tell you it's going to be easy. I don't know whether we'll be victorious in my lifetime, but we have no other option but to fight. Fight he did. I mean, he died, but the army fought, and it was his decision not to capitulate that saved the day. It's a remarkable moment. So I blame him but then I tear when I read these things. There's something very compelling, very, very compelling about him. And I have to admit, I don't really know him. I mean, Amir is easy to figure out. According to Ilyas Khouri, هو ده اللي هينجح الفيلم. He's the guy who will carry the movie if this is. But Nasser is a complex figure, very, very difficult.
I have to apologize. You greeted me and I had no idea. I mean, we go way back. Delighted you were here after that. His father knew Nasser. That I do know.
I remember visiting your father and seeing pictures of many pictures.
Thank you. I have a couple of questions from Jonathan Wynn. And I'm going to start with the one closer to, oh, sorry. It is on. Jonathan Wynn, sorry. He's a guest online here. And let me start with the second question. Still not clear, he says, the purpose of threatening Israel by closing the straits, given what was happening in Yemen. Could you say anything about that?
Yes, I think I tried to say that this was not something that Nasser really wanted. Again, he was egged on the one hand by Amir, telling him, we're ready, we kicked out the United Nations troop. What do you do? Our men are now in Sharm el-Sheikh. What do we do? I'm ready. On the other hand, he's also not sitting idle. He had been, I think, victim of his own rhetoric. I mean, this is what populist leaderships end up doing. And he kept on saying, because throughout the 60s, throughout, 65, 66, the Syrians and the Saudis and occasionally the Jordanians are telling him, and I'm sure you know this famous phrase, you're hiding behind the skirts of the United Nations. So now that the United Nations are kicked out, what do we do with the Straits? And his option, he knew that this would escalate the possibility of war significantly. But I think my best explanation is that he felt that he had no other option. And he thought, this is where Haeckel's insight, I think, comes handy, that he could still manage it the way he managed 56. Somehow he could find a way out without having to actually fight.
Let me, yes, please. Oh, sorry.
A two-part question. Can you comment a little bit about the morale of the Egyptian army during the process? And the second part is, can you comment a little bit on the Soviet Union during this period, both in terms of supplying the army and influencing the foreign policy Egypt at the time?
The morale of the men, we know very little about this. We know that we don't have memoirs. We don't have enough memoirs of soldiers. The memoirs we have are actually two of people who end up being imprisoned, taken POWs, and they wrote about their experience in captivity. But they are both officers rather than men.
Did the Yemen war also was a cancer on the morale as well?
I don't know how many people who fought in 67 had been moved from the Yemen theater of operations. I don't have this figure somewhere, but what we know is that because of the very bad mobilization orders, Egypt doesn't till today have a very efficient mobilization system. Most of the people came with no training, with no uniforms. They came with their galabiyas and they were sent to the front with no weapons. So we have accounts of fatalities because of the havoc on the way there, east, rather than on the way back. Of course, on the way back was even more. So we know that some people, we have accounts by the army after defeat. We have accounts of demonstrations. We have the famous demonstration in Cairo asking Nasser to stay. We have the demonstrations in Suez or Ismailia against Nasser by the men. So I think, again, part of the weakness of the system is that the Arab Socialist Union, of course, the Arab Socialist Union is created as a counter force to the army. So actually it has no influence on the army. ASU had failed in its job to mobilize or indoctrinate. So, I mean, we know the rhetoric of Nasser. We know a lot about what is said, but to what degree it seeps through the minds of the soldiers fighting, and to what degree they understood what it is that they're fighting for, either in Yemen or in 67, is something I wish I can do. We have few, but I don't think the army was aware of the complexity or, however, again, these memoirs of people in captivity, Israelis used to play on loudspeakers songs making fun of Nasser. Songs that they thought would be understood as making fun of Nasser. Egyptian songs. The response of the men in camps was to stage a revolution, demonstrations for Nasser. So the soldiers taken prisoner in Atlit in Israel throughout until they were released in January of '68, they were singing Nasser's praise, name. The Soviet Union, I mean, the big question about the Soviet Union is why did they pass on this erroneous message that the Israelis were amassing troops? For many years, the Soviet archives were closed. Now they're open. There is a book that came out, and the best explanation of that book to that question is that it's not true that the Soviets thought the Arabs would win. They were not absolutely sure that they would lose. What they wanted was to create a crisis that would enhance their presence in the region and would enhance the dependence of the Arabs on them. That's the main conclusion of this particular chapter in the book. Did the Soviets dictate Egyptian foreign policy? No. I mean, in a sense, when, you know, Egypt was really never a client state of the Soviets, and Nasser was never a client, was never that dependent. However, I'm discovering now that the reliance on the Soviet Union, the issue of the Soviet Union in terms of armaments and advising and the advisors that were sent was a thorny issue in the army. Repeatedly, in fact, I should have said this, this is the one common thread that runs throughout Amir's position. He disagreed with Nasser vehemently. I mean, if one wants to understand Amir, I mean, Amir, of course, doesn't write, he hasn't left much, and we don't know ideologically where his position was. I don't think he really fought the Saudis in Yemen. I mean, this is a money-making business for him and a way to stay in business. But as far as the Soviet Union is concerned, he and many of the high brass, many of his men were very opposed to relying on the Soviet Union. And they thought, and till today, many of them still think that it's the Soviet Union who triggered this crisis intentionally. And there was a coup staged in 1972, this we know, by someone for the same reason. So this was a thorny issue, and the extreme of them would go as far as to paint it religiously, to say this is godless heathens, and Nasser is a communist, and we wouldn't stand by this. So this continues to be a line, and in a sense, when you think about this, this is how I understand Sadat. I mean, Sadat is not, in a sense, you know, Sadat was not parachuted from the sky. Sadat is part of this regime. So Sadat, like Amir, is the right wing of Nasser's regime. The cleverness of Sadat is that he managed to find I think Amir's overall strategy was that this is not our fight. We should go to Washington and tell them, even before the defeat, we have nothing to do with the Palestinian issue. We just want out. I mean, that's to give him the benefit of the doubt. That's to give, you know, and this reliance on the Soviet Union is fatal for us. We should, and he would say, Nasser, you have to go to Washington, not to sign, go to visit. You have to understand them. And Nasser refused. He would visit the Western countries, most famously Paris, and come back and say, you don't know what we're missing out on. But he couldn't find a way to do this. I think it is Sadat who finally managed to solve this riddle, but that's another story.
Maybe just time for one question from here. Sorry, Jonathan Wynn, but I've just got to give someone else a chance before we close down. I'm speaking to the ether here. This is from Arag Danagulian. He says, I see some similarities between the post-Soviet states and Egypt, in that the power, instead of being accumulated in state institutions, is almost entirely accumulated in individuals who build personality cults to achieve more power. In the ex-Soviet Union, we tend to blame Tsarism, Stalinism, and their legacy as a way of explaining this. Is there a similar legacy in Egypt that comes from its history? It's a
Yeah, no, it's a good question.
Yeah.
It's a good question. Of course, some people would say Egypt is the land of the pharaohs. It goes all the way back to pharaonic history. No, this is exactly my point. I mean, Egypt in the 60s, I mean, this is what I study. This book that you mentioned, about forensic medicine, this is my attempt to understand the modern Egyptian state. It's a state of institutions. We had hospitals, we had a press, we had a parliament, we had an army, we had a police force, we had a government, we had a cabinet, a government in the 1850s. Nasser, when he came to power in 52, Egypt had 150 years of building institutions. And one of the things that I'm studying is how unwittingly, I don't think he intended to erode these institutions, but this is what he did. And part of the way to explain this is, again, this struggle with Amir. He had to rely, what we call sometimes his charisma was not just a God-given fate. This is his only way out. With Nasser, with Amir controlling the army, Nasser had no way but to, or so he thought. He could have relied on the institutions, but he didn't. And that's, I blame him for this. I say, he didn't need to build institutions. There were, and when you see what Nasser did from 53 to 56, of the emergency laws that were passed with no parliament, that transferred so much of power of the king to the presidency and enhanced them to the degree that it eclipsed anything else within the civilian bureaucracy, and thinking that he can steer things through is again one fatal line that he took.
So is the ASU in the 60s the next stage of deinstitutionalizing and putting, or not?
The ASU is a very haphazard way of trying to find an ideology and an institution to mobilize the people. I mean, I'm not simply saying, I'm not making a liberal argument of where is parliamentary democracy and free press. This is a world revolution. I mean, Egypt was really leading a world revolution. The way to confront, he opened up so many fronts, is to deepen the revolution, empower the people. And the ASU failed to do that and ended up being a mechanism of him spying on his own elite and using it against the army. This is a failed state, with amazing personalities in it, but it's a failed state. That's my only way to explain this catastrophic defeat.
This has really been a terrific talk. We can't wait to read your book.
Can't wait to write it.
Which you will.
Yes.
As I said, your pen is hard to run.
Thank you so much. Thanks.
Thank you, and hope to see you in the fall. Thank you.
I've been coming to these even when I was this one.